Thank you very much, Ryan. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank the organisers for the chance to say a few words about the smart city phenomenon. I want to stress that I'm coming at this from an urbanist point of view and from a critical urban geography point of view, and I want to stress the way in which the smart city rubric that Ryan talks about is becoming a huge sort of bandwagon in a constellation of urban planning interests, real estate interests, civil engineering interests, and obviously all of the digital media and surveillance corporations that we're talking about. So what is being sold here is to a lot of these guys, and it's nearly always guys, highly gendered discourse being sold, is this reappearance, if you like, of a classic sort of high modernist discourse of control, perfect real-time anticipation where finally all of the information of this disparate entity we call the city can be brought to bear in a sort of panoptic surveillance machine. It's a fusion, and I don't need to tell you guys this, of a whole range of different technocultural discourses surrounding robotization, anticipation, big data, geodata, Internet of Things, and so on. And what's powerful is the way the bandwagon of the smart city is layering over a whole series of other policy bandwagons that have mobile dynamics around the world to do with creative cities, smart you see, I can't even remember. Resilient cities. The whole thing just becomes a giant sort of smorgasbord of, frankly, increasingly meaningless terms and interchangeable terms that co-constitute this broader effort to build what Dana Cuff has called enacted environments, physical, material, urban environments that are continually brought into being through their remediation. The discourse is palpably here one that overlaps so powerfully with the discourses in the military and security sectors, and I want to emphasize this. The military sectors in the last 40 years, particularly driven by the US, have been obsessed by a sense of an inability to control, an inability to harness the data that is coming from a whole range of sensors, an inability to bring real-time decision-making to bear. And this is just a quote from one of the myriad of corporations that are trying to build urban operating systems, to build their systems and standards into the heart of the so-called smart city. So this is IBM in 2002, emphasizing that, there needs to be a final push, and it's always about this time it will be different. This time we will be omniscient and be in control. Older systems were always messy and flaky and imperfect and slow and so on. This time we will have this panoptic dream. The discourses that we're hearing from Adam Greenfield's really wonderful work, critiquing the ideas of the smart city, are always presented as deterministic, self-evident, often messianic, and again they overlap with a lot of historical genealogies and technocultural history. So Adam Greenfield's emphasizes, this is a quote, that they tend to be discussed casually as if it was self-evident that all one needed to finally solve the city is to weave sensors into the urban fabric, by the million, trawl the relevant social networks for geo-tagged utterances, and apply just the right analytical algorithms to the ever-mounting tally of terabytes captured this way. I think it's very important not to get transfixed just by discourses of surveillance here, because we're seeing parallel shifts and parallel combinations of visualization and surveillance technologies, echoing in many ways the whole idea of SimCity, the godlike operator trawling data in a continual iterative process to reshape and remanage the physical environment as represented in digital visualizations that overlap increasingly with the ways in which these real projects are being discussed. And I know Tobias has got some of this to come. And this is something that William Bogard talks about a lot in his rather wonderful but often neglected book, The Simulation of Surveillance. what I want to stress, a few skeptical points. Obviously, I suspect everyone in this room is highly skeptical to these narratives and discourses. But I want to stress a few points in the time I have. One, this is nothing new. There's a long history to this. I did my PhD on urban efforts to shape IT infrastructures, and I started that in the late 80s. The narratives and the discourses are always about messianic newness, and this time it will be differentness. And this is a slide from a website which I don't think even exists now, called Siliconia, from the early 90s, just showing you all of the different place branding labels that were flying around the world, from real estate developers, urban managers, planners, architects, and so on. There's a very long history to trying to add value in terms of the production of cities, the production of space. And you can add to all of the ones that have been done since: the intelligent city, obviously the great wild frenzy of creative city debates as Richard Florida flew around the world with his team, making sure that everybody was obsessed with getting more gay people because it would make their cities more creative, you know. Secondly, the Messianic discourses are as old as the hills. This is just to remind people of some of the wild stuff that was coming out of the sort of wired utopianism in the early 90s with the Cyberspace Debate. Michael Benedict's is my favorite. There are many others, but just look at the claims here, the deterministic inevitability of some utopian future where everybody would basically be living a perfect life. They would be decontaminating urban and landscapes, redeeming them, saving them from the chain dragging bulldozers of the paper industry, the diesel smoke of courier and post office trucks. A lot of this was dematerialization, the end of travel, the end of the city, the end of the body. We know all of that. And this was this powerful, obsessive, sort of fetishistic dream. We can go even further back to the discourses that surrounded the invention and diffusion of the telegraph and the telephone way back in the late 19th century. And I'd highly recommend Caroline Marvin's rather wonderful book that really goes into this in great depth. So secondly, I think it's very clear we're just seeing the smart city rhetoric as being produced by these various coalitions, revivifying these old cybernetic fantasies, but very often camouflaging authoritarian and elitist transformations. And I think this is increasingly clear. We have to picture this alongside all of the data on increasing social polarization, increasing domination of tiny cabals of super rich, orchestrating global production, financial landscapes, and so on. Those things are not separate from the smart city phenomenon. And I think Lily Bree, in her recent writings in the Census Journalism Lab, say that, you know, in marketing materials and press releases, it's all about this idyllic, green visualizations. We can see here the weird juxtapositions in this image of skyscrapers, renewable energies, and little forests of CCTV cameras. So there's a huge amount of highly problematic and camouflaging going on here. What's often really important to stress too is that these smart city rhetorics, they overlap with a much broader shift to questions of pre-mediation and anticipatory surveillance, where the very politics of what is normal in a city is rendered moot, is rendered open, and is problematically refocused. The whole obsession here in terms of the securitization of cities is with anticipatory sensing of risky environments where the so-called threat is impossible to distinguish from the background of urbanism and infrastructure and its lives and signatures. So what becomes obsessive in these discourses is capturing all the data in advance and building these mythological algorithms that will supposedly identify the abnormal against a background that is conservatively rendered as normal. Just some efforts here from early video analytics programs to sense car park functioning in in Massachusetts, I think. These systems allegedly, I'm sure it's much more messy than that, as it always is, can distinguish the safe passage of the threatened civilian in this space from the unusual event of the cyclist. So the car driver is identified as someone under threat, whilst the unusual behavior of the cyclist is deemed to be in some way abnormal. It's much more complex than that. But we need to also overlap this with the extraordinary revelations of the last few years in terms of military-industrial complexes and that great push into global data harvesting that we see brought to bear in sites like the NSA's massive new facility in Utah. We need to render this visible through the likes of Bureau d'Etudes, who have done a lot of critical work on the profoundly undemocratic political economy of data capture and how this is organized through totally non-democratic processes around the world. And we need to, again, as I stress, keep the smart city discourse with the securitization discourse. This is aside from the Defense Sciences Board in 2002, looking at this obsession with the city as a threat, the sense that whatever is the threat is indistinguishable from the background. So hence this obsession with trying to identify and track the apparent threat. So here we see a discourse where enemy leaders look like everyone else, enemy combatants look like everyone else, enemy vehicles look like enemy civilian vehicles, and so on. And the obsession then becomes this drive for ubiquitous tracking, which leads to the growth of the fusion centers, which leads to the growth of the global SIGINT platforms that the NSA have been placing around the world in partnership with IT providers. This, again, is all very familiar. But Trevor Paglen's very powerfully showing you that this comes down to real installations in real places. This is the NSA's Dagger complex, just a small, banal, and apparently inobtrusive little facility hooked into some of the key nodes in global optic fiber transnational systems. And just to stress again, and I'm almost done, that again, there's nothing new here. These deep overlaps between military and security corporations and civil media, so-called civil media, are often overlooked. They're often not made as explicit as they need to be. There's some great historical work on the role of defense intellectuals in American cities in the Cold War, for example, by Jennifer Light. And she looks at how Rand Corporation and others managed to permeate and penetrate a whole load of urban discourses surrounding urban renewal, surrounding cybernetic planning, surrounding autobahns, surrounding the building of the highway systems and so on. And we see these current constellations, what I would call the new military urbanism constellations, or the Foucauldian boomerangs, where experiments in colonial frontiers boomerang back into the securitized sites of the domestic city. We see it startlingly in places like Oakland. Oakland is at the heart of a hugely contested politics of attempted militarized surveillance for the entire city, justified by the Homeland Security Department in the US on the back that this is a highly vulnerable and strategic node in blah, blah, blah. So the Domain Awareness Center that's been projected and built in Oakland is doing all of the things that the Smart City project would possibly dream of. Video analytics, alarm monitoring, real-time data management, and so on. But it's profoundly contested because there's some seriously powerful social movements taking it on board and managing to expose what is often a black box. And this is why it's so crucial. The third and final point I want to stress is to reiterate that the big IT corporations are working incredibly hard so that their systems and their software and their expertise can penetrate into what becomes sedimented in as the basic infrastructural parameters and protocols of the so-called smart cities. This is a profoundly massive market that's using particular exemplars of certain sites and certain cities, often symbolic, often sites that don't even exist, to be packaged and resold around the world as other planners and development agencies seek to sell and package their own cities on the smart cities bandwagon. Let me just finish by stressing, and hopefully this will work quite a lot with some of the later discussions, the way that these smart city utopias / dystopias, depending on your point of view, are very much coming down into these exemplar locations. We're seeing, you always hear the same places and the same sites endlessly repeated in these debates. And it's the same with a lot of other urban planning discourses. We live in a world where urban planning discourses are profoundly mediated by transnational efforts to ape other exemplars through mobile practice, mobile policies that are being organized through a whole load of different processes. So there are plenty of others, but I'm sure you're probably aware of Masdar City in Abu Dhabi, which is something that Foster's heavily involved with. Another classic sort of green, apparently green enclave, sold on the back of sustainability, quote, on the back of smartness, quote. Songdo in South Korea is one that's actually being built, but again, it's so powerful that its operating systems are already being sold around the world as a protocol in advance of that. And the one I think is perhaps most powerful is Eco-Atlantic, a giant new island being built off the coast of Lagos, ostensibly again as a green and sustainable smart city. But the realities here is that it's about building defensive enclaves for the Nigeria's wealthy to articulate with the global neoliberal economy through sites that are effectively far more resilient in the face of global climate change and sea level rises. So we need to be very, very careful that the smart city rhetoric is brought into a much broader critical politics of the urban. This is what I'm trying to stress, and that it's contested in a way that opens these often obfuscatory black boxes beyond the profoundly problematic discourses and visualizations that surround it. This is what I would particularly stress here. So I will stop there, Ryan. Thank you very much for your time.